Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Adobe Think Tank. We are here live at the New York Times New Work event in Half Moon Bay, California. I'm Dan Puterbaugh with Adobe, and I am lucky enough at this time to be joined by Mark Grilli, Vice President of Product Marketing for Document Cloud, also at Adobe. Welcome to the Think Tank.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Glad to be here.
Yeah.
Very cool event.
Yeah, and with as many glass walls as you could ever possibly hope for.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly.
Already at the conference this afternoon, we've really been talking about sort of emerging technologies, how they're going to impact things, what the possible outcomes of those could be. I know that you've talked a fair amount about online experiences in many ways being broken and really not operating the way that people expect them to. How do you think that can be fixed? How do you think that some of these emerging technologies, especially AI, can sort of play a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to see a lot more personalization coming across where the site you're navigating to will change based off of some simplistic models of what you are, who you are. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more AI helping with understanding how to better tune the experience. Because you kind of think about it, like our generation, we had to learn software to accomplish something. Right. And the younger generation doesn't have the patience to do that. And so now what you're going to see is that the experiences will start being tuned for them, and it'll be much more intuitive and sort of repeated patterns where instead of having a coder sitting behind it figuring it out, the machine will do it for you. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more sort of behavior changes because you should just expect things to change for you.
Right. So there's an expectation then that whether you're landing on a web page or whether you're even landing in a document, that you're going to have something that's going to be responsive to you, know what other things you've looked at in the past, know kind of like how you like to have things presented to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the expectations of the younger generation is things should just work. You shouldn't have to fill out your name 5 times. You shouldn't have to identify yourself in 5 different settings or 5 different forms. And it just kind of makes sense. But it's actually what we've come to accept as the way things are done, which is sort of silly in a way.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think that, certainly whenever I have to fill out something and fill it out 5 different times, I get frustrated, but I probably don't react to it with the same kind of horror that somebody younger might, where that's just anathema to how they operate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, so along those same lines, I mean, what do you think sort of Generation Z, those born between 95 and sort of the mid-2000s, what do you think they're sort of bringing to the table as far as when we're looking at products, when we're looking at features and sort of how they approach how things should function and UI and that kind of thing?
Well, it's sort of interesting because I'm a parent and I have kids in exactly that age range, and so
bring that up. But I was thinking that would be you've got some examples at home.
Exactly, and so it's sort of fascinating when they're doing their school paper. They sort of think about things in one way, but then I watch them play a video game and they think about them entirely differently. And so, us as software developers, we would think, oh, we have to create an experience that's super simple. But actually, you go look at things like Minecraft, which they're amazingly experts at, and it's not simple. It has an infinite amount of things you can do, and they understand that too. And so I think this inherently is going to be a balance of how do you provide the power and the simplicity of learning, and the sort of wherewithal for people to get past the first learning curve. What I've found with my kids, and I think it's sort of, maybe it's my kids are the only ones that do this, but I suspect it's more, is that they simply will just abandon and find another way. And so an example being is like they couldn't figure out how to get a printer working at home. So what they did is they actually emailed it to themselves and they took a picture on their phone, a screenshot, and then they were able to figure something out. Like I would never have thought of doing that, but that's what they did.
Yeah. I think I think some of the early examples of that I saw were, I think this was years ago now, because I now do this for everything, but I needed to remember some piece of information, and she just immediately took a photo of it, and I think I had actually been quite foolishly reaching for a pen.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Which really doesn't make any sense at all in the current environment.
No, right? And it causes us as providers of solutions to rethink our mindset. We come to things with a sort of bias that we have to make sure we understand the bias isn't there, or a bias is a different bias.
Right.
And so learning and constantly interacting with your customers and understanding their needs and what they're trying to accomplish, that's what we do as marketers and software developers.
Right. Right. And a lot of what you do is really focused on sort of helping people to get work done remotely. And increasingly I know you do, and certainly I spend a ton of my time on video conferences of one kind or another. But I've had some interesting conversations already today with those who say, even among sort of Generation Z, who you might think would be entirely comfortable with that there's still a need for these sort of, IRL, in real life, face-to-face experiences. Do you agree with that? Do you think that there's a way to kind of create a pathway to that, as well as enable all of these sort of remote working tools?
I think this really is no substitute. And I feel like working environments are these pendulum swings of, everything's got to be open space, to everything's got to be in person, to everything can be completely remote. And it's some happy medium between all of that. In our team or our experience in working, you have to find that balance, because there is something valuable about the hallway conversation where, we talk about something we did over the weekend, where if you're only on video, you're only talking about the meeting you have, only the topic, and it's sort of dry, and it loses an element of the thing that helps you want to motivate as a team. And I feel like that's sort of invaluable. And I think the other thing is that we've had to adapt our work style to the people that were before us. It's about understanding that it's not just one generation that rules. It's about adapting to the cross-generational needs. Because if your customers, if you're Gen Y, Z, or new name, whatever, and you're building something for people who are not in your generation, the same thing holds true. They need to understand the audience, and they need to adapt their style. And I think work-life balance and work style is the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think it is interesting as well that certainly there are these sort of generational differences, but there are at times, it seems, so many exceptions to that. To your point with Minecraft being highly complex, and yet an entire generation has absolutely cracked the nut on that one, and does some rather remarkable things in that. Do you think that there's an element as well where perhaps to run counter to some of the stuff that we're talking about, that it really is sort of psychographics rather than demographics or generational, that there are those who are simply going to be more comfortable with certain work styles than with others?
No, absolutely. And in real life, we've been doing this exact experiment in our own, the way we work, right? The thing that we talk about is, if you're called into a meeting and you're just a phone voice versus if you're in person, the interactions are totally different, and you're less likely to speak up. And then you add the psychographic element to it. And if you simply say introvert and extrovert, introverts are not likely to speak up. So you have someone who's on the phone who will not jump in and not say the thing that could be the most valuable thing to unlock the meeting, the business, whatever the thing you're trying to do.
Right.
And so it's sort of fascinating to kind of put people in places where they can't hide, or in the case of an extrovert, can't dominate the conversation.
Right.
And you sort of get the right team participation.
Yeah.
And again, it's a interesting, like, there's no one answer, it's just a mix of things.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. When the introvert is in the conference room and not saying anything, there is sometimes someone will say, "Hey, what does Bob think?"
Right.
But if they're on the phone, there's sort of almost no chance that they're going to be pulled into the conversation.
It's hard to interrupt, right?
Yeah, and I think as well with that sort of remote work style, one of the things that I've seen that is a little bit generationally different is, we tend to, when we're on video conferences, we're a bit all business, and I've seen some generations seem to be much more comfortable sort of, well, let me take you for a walk around my house, which
right.
almost mimics some of that same sort of hallway conversation.
No, absolutely, and I think that's the balance that anyone has to strike, and I think the new generation just brings in another element to the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great. Thanks so much for joining us
great to be here.
this evening in the Big Glass Box.
Really cool.
Thanks so much for joining us for this discussion. Be sure to follow us along on Twitter at #AdobeTT, and stay tuned for some future live streams coming up later this evening and some early tomorrow morning.